Alright everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to do a video talking about all things ribcage compression. I noticed it popping up quite a bit as a conversation topic on social media, mostly through short form content, and people seem to be either really confused or overwhelmed by it. You got some people saying it doesn't matter at all, just don't pay attention to it. Then you've got other people saying it's one of the biggest rocks that's going to underpin your physique development, staying pain or injury free. And as usual, I think that the truth is somewhere in between. I've said this before, classically when it comes to strength training or bodybuilding anatomy, we sort of think about you've got your legs and then your hips and then your spine and your shoulders, and people just completely overlook the rib cage. The rib cage is a pretty big structure just to completely overlook. I know a lot of people trying to move away from being too neurotic about biomechanics, but I don't think acknowledging that the rib cage exists and has an impact on the way that we move is being overly neurotic or anything like that. So even though I think some people might be making way too big of a deal and being a little bit too neurotic about this whole idea of rib cage compression, I do think there's some value in one, acknowledging the existence of the rib cage and thinking about its impact on the way we move, the way we recruit different muscles, and our movement strategies overall. And I think potentially what's been the most confusing thing about this whole rib cage compression fiasco for a lot of people is, a lot of the time when we're thinking about rib cage, they're thinking about all these parts of it. Whereas where a lot of this compression is happening for a lot of people, that's leading to these apparent problems with their training, the way that they move, or maybe putting them in a little bit of pain, majority of the time they're referring to compression on the back side of the rib cage, which is a part of the rib cage that a lot of people just aren't used to considering. A lot of people just choose to ignore the rib cage as a whole, and then when they start to think about rib cage, they're like, oh yeah, rib cage. But we've got rib cage all down here below our scaps. And when you think about typical exercise selection or typical things that people value in technique when it comes to safety or force production, this is ultimately what leads to a lot of this posterior compression of the rib cage. So I think in the bodybuilding space, one of the poster children for posterior rib cage compression that's sort of been held up in front of everyone as an example is Mike Israetel. But to wrap your head around it, most of you people watching this video are probably posteriorly compressed to some extent because it is a very common presentation. But if you really want to wrap your head around this idea of posterior compression and what that actually looks like, I just want you to think about stereotypical powerlifting posture, stereotypical powerlifting technique for force production and keeping things safe apparently, which is big arch in the back, so really extended posture, and then shoulder blades down and back as well. And this is what I think is confusing a lot of people when we're talking about rib cage compression. This looks like an expanded rib cage, but it really is just being shoved forward and compressed from the back. And I think that's another thing that's led to a lot of the confusion. People are just saying broadly rib cage compression without being specific about the part of the rib cage that they're referring to. Because a posteriorly compressed rib cage is going to expand out the front a lot, the same as an anteriorly compressed rib cage is going to expand posteriorly. Just quickly circling back a little bit as well, if you want a good visual of an expanded rib cage, or a rib cage that hasn't been compressed too much, when you go look at some photos of Arnold Schwarzenegger. A lot of the golden era bodybuilders have this quality, but I think genetically speaking, Arnold had just one of the best rib cages I have ever seen in my life. And it's definitely a rib cage that when I look at it, I see a lot of expansion. And I think Arnold was great for so many reasons, but his rib cage was definitely one of his strengths. And it's always a rib cage that I'm pointing to when people are looking for an example of, like I said, a good rib cage for bodybuilding or something like that. Arnold, he was also a pretty good mover for someone who was so heavily muscled. And that could have been just due to his general training variety. Actually, I think that was a huge part of it, but especially when trying to understand why did Arnold have such an amazing chest? Again, chest is one of those muscles that wraps around our rib cage, kind of uses it for a bit to create a bit of a fulcrum. Why did he have such great mobility and things like hip and shoulder separation? Again, he just had a really nice expanded rib cage that he could push into a lot of different shapes. And then stepping outside of the bodybuilding space, I think MMA fighters or people who compete in striking sports in general, again, they just get a lot of movement variety, a lot of twisting, bending, and rotating. They'll typically have quite nice expanded ribcage presentations. Gymnasts are another athlete that I'll point to as examples of athletes with really nice looking rib cages. And again, if you think about their training variety, typically really good movers with a lot of movement variety and a lot of just general movement competencies. And it's interesting when you sort of map out these two camps, I guarantee you a lot of these crowds have never even thought about ribcage compression, but you can sort of see this trend where the people with typically the most compressed rib cages you see have very low movement variety. And then as you start to go over to people with more movement variety comparatively, so powerlifters over here and golden era bodybuilders over here, or powerlifters over here and then gymnasts or martial artists over here, you can see that there's just this general trend of if you have more overall movement variety and movement competency in your programming, you typically see a bit more of an expanded rib cage that can make more shapes, and it has a bit more of an aesthetic presentation, depending on your taste. Which is really interesting to me because a lot of the people, especially in the bodybuilding crowd who are talking about this rib cage compression thing, their solution to avoiding rib cage compression is just to train in this neutral, stacked posture all the time, which I think is probably a good start for a lot of people, especially if you have been doing all of your exercising in these positions like a powerlifter and you never make any other shape when you're training, or this is your shape you make whenever you need to produce a lot of force. Doing some exercises in a less extended posture could be really beneficial. But rather than trying to get everyone to live their life perpetually in a stack or this quote unquote neutral posture, we can sort of see all these people who just have a good amount of training variety, they rarely end up with these rib cage compression issues because, again, they're always challenging their body to make different shapes and open up different parts of the rib cage as a consequence of that. Whereas then again, we have people living in what I would call stacked prison, where I get triggered when people start to talk about neutral posture because it's just not as important as people make it out to be. And typically people who are obsessed with neutral posture, they're a little bit too neurotic and they're always blaming the way that they move for any sort of pain or injury that they're experiencing. And again, we see a lot of the rib cage compression people fear-mongering that, oh, if you have this compressed rib cage, you're always going to move like shit and be in pain. And I think pain and injury, it's a little bit more complex than just how you move. Again, it has an effect on these things, but it's a very small part of a big picture. So something that I really want to hammer home today is rib cage compression is not explicitly a bad thing. It's neutral. It can be good or bad depending on what we're trying to do. But if you're starting to think to yourself like, wait, I'm not a powerlifter, but I probably do move a little bit like a powerlifter. Like I arch my back and I pin my shoulders down and back whenever I'm trying to produce a lot of force, whether it's benching, whether it's rowing, or whenever you're doing any lifting with your lower body, you're always super rigid about not letting your spine flex. Maybe you think that spinal flexion is unsafe, so you're like, well, I'll just extend my spine as hard as possible whenever I lift. This is very common for a lot of people. I think one of the fairer points that a lot of the bodybuilders are making about this rib cage compression is it's a little bit of a symptom of ego lifting. Like at the end of the day, if you're just trying to get as much weight on the bar as possible, you probably should squeeze all the air out of the back of your rib cage and lock your shoulders down and back. Whether you're squatting, whether you're deadlifting, or whether you're pressing or rowing, you're going to be able to move a lot of weight that way. But the reason that you're moving so much weight when you adopt this posture is in every movement you do, your spinal erectors are just doing so much of the work for you. Whether it's creating that stability there or just helping you shorten the range of motion. Whereas if you really put your bodybuilding cap on instead of your I'm just going to move as much weight as possible cap or your powerlifting cap, what you would probably do is just think about stretching and squeezing the muscle under load as much as possible. And especially thinking about like if I'm going to take my pecs or my lats through a fuller range of motion, it's going to be hard if I'm stuck in this position. I'll probably have a much better shot at that if I'm in this more neutral or stacked position. So let's unpack the stack. So a lot of people, they make this mistake when they're thinking about a neutral posture. They just think about having as straight of a spine as possible. But what that really does is it sort of shoves you forward onto your toes and it opens you up here and it puts your pelvic floor and your thoracic diaphragm, these two domey tent-like structures that help us manage pressure in our thorax, it puts them into this open scissor position. So your pelvic floor is this dome-like structure sitting in your pelvis, and then you've got your thoracic diaphragm, which attaches to your spine and the front of your ribs, which is a similar sort of shape. And so in order to create this stacked or neutral posture, what you're essentially being told to do is instead of just straightening your spine as much as possible, just think about getting your pelvic floor and your thoracic diaphragm stacked directly over the top of each other. And then the final part of the stack is your noggin as well. So hopefully my head, it's probably shoved forward a little bit because I got that text neck, but the full stack is head over rib cage, over pelvis, and just stacking all those diaphragms. And hopefully when you're doing that, you actually have a little bit of lumbar lordosis, you got a little bit of thoracic kyphosis, and then back into lordosis when you're getting to the neck, and then a kyphotic curve at the back of the noggin. So if you really want to unpack the stack, I suggest you look a bit into like PRI. Again, be careful sticking your foot down that rabbit hole. It'll undo a lot of lifters and send them mad, but they're the ones that came up with it at the end of the day. And so yeah, if you've gone from training in this position and then you go to doing more of your training in this position, whether you're pressing, whether you're rowing, or whether you're working your lower body, it's gonna change the way you're recruiting different muscles. And I think that's the thing, in order to train even any muscle group holistically, you actually need to put your body in a variety of different positions. But again, if all you know in your training is this powerlifting style arch with your shoulders down and back, again, it's gonna affect the way your muscles present and also the way that they're recruited. And again, a lot of things are just gonna be spinal erecticity. But then again, you probably will have a strong back and you probably have a really nice bussy. But just because this posteriorly compressed posture affects the way that we move, I don't think it's something we need to remove from our training, even if you're a bodybuilder. It's just that you just don't want to be making that shape for every single exercise you do. So like for me, I'll do like a powerlifting style bench press with a big arch in my back and trying to let my scaps move as little as possible to reduce the range of motion, because ultimately I am just trying to get as much weight on the bar as possible. But then for my secondary pressing, which might be like a dumbbell press, I might actively try and push my ribcage back into the bench and even pull my feet up a bit and put them on something. I think a lot of people seeing people doing like hook lying style feet up bench presses. Again, a lot of the reason why people are doing that is to get out of that posteriorly compressed position and into more of a stacked posture. I'm also really inspired by gymnasts and the way that they train. So really what I like to do is a mixture of like powerlifting style training in this position, but then a lot of gymnastics training. Yes, they do use this extended position sometimes, but there's a lot more flexion, like not even stacking, actually going beyond that, flexing even harder, reaching as far as possible, a lot of anterior compression. Like that's a much better solution for me, rather than just living in this stacked or neutral posture. I would rather explore much more either side of that and get my gains that way. I think you end up with the same outcomes and the process is a little bit more fun. Again, we're not being neurotic about this stacked position for every single exercise. We're just putting a focus on putting our body into as many different positions as possible and being strong in a variety of ranges of motion and a variety of different orientations. I think that that's really, really cool, because take it from me as someone who has been down this ribcage compression rabbit hole, whether it's your PRI rabbit hole or your compression expansion model rabbit hole. You know, as much as I criticize people for being completely oblivious to the ribcage, then we have this whole other crowd that learns about the ribcage, becomes fucking obsessed with it, really neurotic about it, and then always managing their ribcage position when they're training. And it just turns you into a cuck, quite frankly. As much as I agree with all these people who are talking about, you know, the position of the ribcage, it affects the way we recruit different muscles and it affects the way we present our muscles, I'm completely on board with that. What I'm not on board with is trying to explain people's pain or injury based on the posture that they're lifting in or the posture that they present in. Pain is a biopsychosocial experience. It's not a byproduct solely of the positions that you train in or your static posture. So a lot of you people with jacked up shoulders or jacked up backs thinking, oh, I'll just do all my exercises in this stacked posture and then I won't have any pain or injuries. Complete and utter nonsense. Again, your body's adaptable. You can adapt and get stronger and more resilient in this position. You can adapt, get stronger and more resilient in this position. And sure, you can do that with the stack as well. I don't care how fucking stacked you are. If you train or program like a cunt, you are gonna be in pain and you're gonna get injuries. And don't get me wrong, like there are probably people who have been relieved of a bit of their pain by getting out of that extended posture. But the way I sort of explain that is, if you have one posture that you use for everything, like of course the loads that you put on certain structures are going to be comparatively higher. We have a finite rate of adaptation, and if you're trying to do a lot of training but you only have one position for every single exercise, then I can see how that can lead to some structures getting overworked and you have a load management issue which leads to pain or injury. So putting your body into a few different positions, I actually think it increases the amount of training volume that you can tolerate, just because you're loading your structures a little bit more variably. But it's not this magical cure that a lot of people are making it out to be, just like, oh, stack yourself, all these compression problems go away. At the end of the day, if you're banging heavy weights, you're gonna get jacked up occasionally. It just doesn't matter what position you do it in. So yes, let's keep this wonderful conversation going about the existence of a rib cage and the way it impacts the way that we move and recruit different muscles. But can we move on from this narrative about posture explaining every pain and injury that you've ever had? This information is literally over 50 years old at this point. Stop trying to explain pain and injury with biomechanics alone. It's fucking stupid. All right, 100 kilo Smith machine bench PR. I want 5 of these. I want 5 with lots of RIRs. Fuck. Come on, fast. I reckon I could have got at least 2. At least 2 more. I could have got 2 more. A few RIR. I think one of the other things that can be quite unaesthetic when you're really compressed at the back of the rib cage is it leads to a lot of like spilling out the front of your tummy. So you'll see people where they don't have much body fat, but then they've still got this really big protruding belly. And so a big part of that, obviously you've got really concentrically oriented spinal erectors, really eccentrically oriented abs. You've also got your abdominal viscera. Like your abdominal viscera needs somewhere to go. And if you have no space in the back of your rib cage, it's just gonna spill out the front. Whereas all of a sudden, when you open up a little bit more space at the back of your rib cage, then your vital organs aren't gonna spill out the front of your tummy so much. Because yeah, just so many people, again, they're breathing, but there's just no air getting in the back here. So it's just a diaphragm pushing all your organs sort of outwards like that. All of a sudden, if you get your thoracic diaphragm above your pelvic bowl, then all of a sudden the diaphragm, it's gonna push the organs. I mean, not only are you going to have more space for the organs in the back here, your diaphragm, in theory, will push your vital organs more directly downward and into your pelvic bowl. And again, typically, when you get these diaphragms pumping in unison, the rib cage expands and compresses a little bit more evenly. It's when we get into these postures, either side of neutral, that we're really biasing this anterior or posterior compression and then expansion on the other side. Okay, so other than not just training like a powerlifter all the time and not training with a really extended spine and your shoulders down and back, what else can we do to alleviate people from this horrible ribcage compression? I think training your abs properly is a phenomenal strategy for this, especially if you like a lot of those powerlifting setups, like you feel really strong with the pressing and rowing positions, I guess, that puts you in. You can just, throwing in some crunching, some side bending and some twisting, that's really gonna pull you out of that position and expand and compress some different parts of your ribcage. So I really love that as a strategy. Probably one of the things we haven't covered enough in this video yet is how the position of the scaps or the shoulder blades can influence airflow through the ribcage or expansion and compression there. So if you're doing all of your exercises with your shoulder blades packed, again, you're gonna be very compressed at the back of the rib cage. And one of the ways we can open that up is with some scapular protraction. And so a lot of people, they just think about exercises like push-ups or again, maybe, like these hook lying, more flat back pressing exercises or just rowing. But there's an infinite amount of ways we can include reaching in our program to open up those back ribs. And one of my absolute favorites is this squat curl for that exact reason. Training your arms in different protracted positions is a really, really good way of exploring this. So obviously we've got our squat curl where you can be protracting in low shoulder flexion. It's really going to help open you up at the back of the rib cage, especially below the scaps. We can also do reaching and curling or even tricep extending in the middle of this sort of reaching arc or even in this higher sort of reaching arc. I think the most useful reaches for a lot of people sort of occur through these positions. And so outside of pressing with a bit more of a flat back or including reaches in a lot of your arm training, again, it's just another reason why I'm such a big fan of including some gymnastics-based training, because it just makes you so much stronger in reaching positions, and it just gives you so many different exercise options where reaching is a big part of a successful strategy, rather than getting punished for reaching like in a bench press or something like that where you just end up extending your range of motion and making your life harder. I totally see what people are saying when they say things like, oh, ribcage compression is basically just from people ego lifting. Like, I'd 100% agree. I just don't want to give up on ego lifting. I love the idea that, I just need to extend my spine and I can produce way more force, or shorten this ROM up and get a whole other plate on the bar. And you don't have to let go of that. Like I said, you just have to have decent fucking training variety. I think it's also another good slight against this, I'm not going to do this exercise because it's not optimal. It's not an S tier exercise. Maybe if you explored some more exercises from A, B, and C tier, you'd actually have a decent training variety, and then you wouldn't be so fucking compressed at the back of your rib cage. Come on. There's no way I would have made that without posterior compression. I think this is another reason why people are talking about breathing technique a lot lately, and I think that this can be a really good strategy as well for just managing compression or expansion in different parts of your rib cage. A lot of people are actually so stiff through this whole structure that they end up being like belly breathers just because it's the path of least resistance. Whereas again, thinking about if we're trying to like pump up our chest and have this really nice fulcrum to stretch our pecs over, some control, a little bit more control over our breathing could probably help us with that. So if you are someone and you notice, and if you notice all the movement is happening here and there's not much movement about the sternum or anything like that when you're breathing, just having a bit more control over your breathing and the positions that you're breathing in can help you get a little bit more air into the back as well as the chest, and just give you a little bit more of a shape to work with and stretch and squeeze those muscles around. So yeah, just trying to keep a little bit more tension in your obliques or all these ab muscles that help control this little corset that your ribcage can form for you, keeping it straight above your pelvis and then breathing into that can help you get a little bit more air into your chest and your back and expand that ribcage, help you wrap those pecs and lats around them. And this is again why you'll see a lot of people doing these breathing drills where they're sort of laying in this 90-90 position. Just allows you to push you back into the ground so you know that you're more open there and you're a little bit more closed off through this path of least resistance out the tummy, and that can sort of help you deliberately push a little bit more air, like I said, into the chest and into the back instead of just doing all that expansion through the tummy. Absolutely nothing wrong with breathing into your tummy like that. It's just not gonna have your ribcage moving as much, and if you're someone who's freaking out about ribcage compression, it's probably not what you want. So this is just another reason why I love exercises like the Gar Hammer raise, because it is just the complete opposite of powerlifting posture. Again, I've got my shoulders protracted so I can hang onto the bench and really drive my spine and ribcage into it, and then just segmental flexion. Okay, fuck your stack. If you want to open up the back of your ribcage and decompress yourself, that's a great way to do it. It's a bit better solution, I think, just trying to move your body a little bit more rather than just going from, oh, well, I was locked into this posture for everything, and now I will just do every other exercise in this posture, and that will fix my problems. I think that's a bit naive. All right, so just to wrap this up, you should not be freaking out about ribcage compression, and it's not the sole reason why you're always feeling jacked up or whatever else is going on with you. You should be aware that you have a rib cage and that it has an influence on the way that you move and the way that you recruit different muscles. If you turn every single exercise into powerlifting style bench press, yes, you'll probably have a pretty compressed rib cage, but it's not the end of the world. Just means you need to train in more relative flexion and protract your shoulder blades a little bit more. And if you're feeling super posteriorly compressed, just doing some breathing in a more flexed position and actively trying to breathe into your back will do a lot of good for you. And maybe as a whole, the strength training and bodybuilding community would benefit from a bit more variety in their training. So rather than eliminating these powerlifting postures in favor of more neutral postures, I say let's keep exploring these powerlifting postures, but let's add in some flex postures, whether it's just through exercise selection and setup or pursuing different activities like a little bit of gymnastics-based strength training. And for fuck's sake, will we stop blaming posture or ribcage presentation for people's pain and injuries? It's so stupid. We don't need to be making people more neurotic about the way that we move. We need to find a way to explore these topics while simultaneously empowering people to explore different movements and to feel more resilient. And like I said, if you have decent training principles, you'll probably never run into an issue of ribcage compression chronically in one area anyway, because I just think it's stupid to always train in the one position. That's not a very robust or well-adapted system. And when people are talking about ribcage compression, they're basically just saying, don't ego lift. Make sure that you're actually moving the parts of your body that you're deliberately training, and do it in a bit more of a neutral posture. All right, anyway, if you're interested in learning more about my philosophy on strength training, there's a really big unit on that in our GPP Level 1 course. Actually, GPP Level 1 would be really good if you're worried about this ribcage compression thing, because I'll teach you all about gymnastics-based strength training and the impact that can have on your ribcage shape as well. So there's a link for that down below if you're interested. Otherwise, I'll see you in a few days with another video.